One common question that gets asked perennially, particularly in discussion groups about Stoicism, has to do with its compatibility with another philosophical approach, perspective, movement, school, however you want to call it, and that's existentialism. Is Stoicism compatible with existentialism? And there is a very simple answer to this, but an unsatisfying one. Yes. Everything is compatible with everything to some extent. So in a very trivial way, yes, Stoicism is compatible with existentialism. But we have to think about, well, what does it mean to be compatible? By that, do you have, some sort of model in mind, like one bit of software being compatible with another bit of software, meaning that they don't interfere with each other, and they have their separate areas that they work with? Stoicism and anything else, any other kind of life philosophy, are not going to be compatible in that way, because they do extend to all sorts of matters: our personal identity, our responsibility, our choices, how we relate to other people, understanding human culture and society, the larger cosmos. You see that this is not that sort of compatibility. So then you can say, well, how would they in fact be compatible? Maybe they have similar doctrines on some things. You can say they're on the same page. Or maybe they provide nice overlaps where they complement each other, where one doesn't have something, the other one can fill that in. Or we might think of other types of compatibility, even as just as weak as not contradicting each other. But compatibility is a relative term. So we can say Stoicism and existentialism are compatible, ... insofar as, and then we start looking at things a little bit more closely, and we find out where they are indeed compatible and where you have to say, well, I'm going to take one of these but not the other one because I can't have both. Interestingly, that's one of the things that both Stoic philosophers and existentialist philosophers thematize. So that very dynamic right there is something that they do share in common. Now, when it comes to existentialism, we have to be a bit more careful than we would with other life philosophies, like, say, Kantianism, where it's closely identified with Immanuel Kant, or even Hegelianism. Existentialism doesn't name a single philosopher or even a single approach or even a single set of beliefs and assertions. Rather, it is a complex, rich, and sometimes contradictory set of thinkers, topics, texts, oftentimes in communication with each other and responding to, sometimes criticizing each other. Even ones that are as close as Sartre and de Beauvoir will differ on some matters. So you can't just say, yes, existentialism is the doctrine that X, Y, Z, because not all the existentialists agree on that. Instead, there's overlapping themes. You should be particularly careful of relying upon Jean-Paul Sartre, who many people take as articulating the existentialist doctrine, because Sartre asserts that he's defining existentialism. It's important to point out that many other existentialists disagree with Sartre on many of the things that he says, including his life partner and, in some respects, corrector Simone de Beauvoir when it comes to certain doctrines about existentialism. So be on your guard about that. Who count in the existentialist spectrum? Well, we have the big three that we often talk about from the 19th century: Søren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, Fyodor Dostoevsky. But there's many other figures in that time that get placed in there, including Ibsen, Tolstoy to some extent. Chekhov. And you notice it's not a French thing, particularly at the start. And then it goes on, and we include people like Miguel de Unamuno in Spain and Leo Shestov, originally in Russia, moving to France after the Russian Revolution. They are existentialists, as is Karl Jaspers and Martin Heidegger. All of these people figure into that field. Even in the French field, we have not just Jean-Paul Sartre, and of course we mentioned Simone de Beauvoir. We have Gabriel Marcel, the first person to use the term existentialism in French, and other Russians like Berdyaev who came. So existentialism is not a single monolithic doctrine. I'll mention as well that Stoicism, while it has a much greater internal consistency, is not a monolithic doctrine either. As Seneca points out, we do not have kings as Stoics, right? So there's variance in how Stoicism itself can be interpreted. So this is very important. There's another thing that I need to point out as well, which is that when you see references to the Stoics, usually written with a lowercase s, in existentialist literature, it will very often not be actual Stoicism, uppercase S, the real philosophy that's out there, partially embodied in Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus and Musonius Rufus and Heracles, and then also talked about in many other authors' works. It's not that, it's kind of a caricature of Stoicism that was popular from about the 19th century all the way deep into the 20th century, where Stoicism is essentially the dichotomy of control and a few other things, withdrawing from the world so that you can be happy and not getting it too involved in things outside of yourself, and repressing emotions, which we know is not genuine Stoicism. So, two things that we've pointed out already. Now let's talk about where existentialism and Stoicism are indeed compatible with each other. So there's a number of different things that we can rattle off, and you can explore these on your own. Really central, the freedom that a human being has to choose, not just between different alternatives, do this, don't do this, not just between prioritizations, this is more important than this, but to choose who one is, what kind of person one is going to be, to determine oneself through the limited freedom that we have within situations in which we do make choices. Another very important thing, the importance of affectivity. I mentioned emotions just earlier. The Stoics think it's very important to understand our emotions. The existentialists think it's very important to analyze and understand and make sense out of what our emotions are telling us. So there's a lot of compatibility there. Choosing for oneself rather than trying to choose for everybody all at once and dominate them. Another key theme. The Stoics don't think that you don't have any connections to other people and that you should behave as best you can like a model person, but they understand that that's not going to necessarily influence others. Even Socrates, as Epictetus says, only succeeded maybe one time out of 1,000 with the people he was talking with. Similarly, for existentialism, you realize that you do, in fact, try to choose for the whole world, but nobody else has to follow you. And this is where Jean-Paul Sartre actually can be helpful. He calls that despair, this realization that when you act, you're acting basically just for that little bit of the universe that is yourself. Living in and learning from concrete human situations, very important for both. And tied in with this, having to figure things out experientially. It's not just a matter of like getting a Stoic or existentialist checklist and doing the exercises and now everything falls into place, or getting the right books and reading them. There's a back and forth dynamic and dialectic with you and the rest of the universe, the little portions that you're engaged with, trying to learn from actually doing things. And then the responsibility that one bears for oneself, for overcoming ignorance or deception, or breaking out of bad uses of our human freedom. very important in both Stoicism and Existentialism. Now, there are some important differences. The Stoics do have a classic literature and a present literature that you can draw upon. The existentialists, 19th and 20th century, there are some present-day existentialists as well. So different works, right, which are not always on exactly the same page. The Stoics do have a substantive conception of human nature and, of morality that existentialists would be a little bit more leery about relying upon, although there's nothing to keep you as an existentialist from saying, well, I think the Stoics actually got it right. I'm going to commit to this. And then finally, for the Stoics, for classic Stoics, and their representatives in the present that we often call traditional Stoics, there are a few things that most existentialists are just simply not going to buy into, that have to do with cosmology, the notion of there being a Stoic kind of God, which is similar to some respects to deism. God is not outside of the universe, but rather, the universe as a totality, so a pantheism. The universe itself is ordered rationally, providentially for the good. Existentialists are pretty much going to reject that, but then again, so do many modern Stoics, so that's not that big of an area of incompatibility unless somebody makes it to be so. So as you can see, the answer to this question is a little bit more complicated than yes or no. It depends on a number of factors.